7 Hidden Health Warnings After 60 Buddhist Teachings and Meditation. Have you ever wondered why the body doesn't always cry out when something is wrong? It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it sighs. Sometimes it trembles. Sometimes it lets go, quietly, like a petal falling in a temple garden when no one is watching. There's a strange paradox in life. We spend so much time caring for others, yet we often forget to listen to the one companion that's been with us since the beginning, our own body. This isn't just a list of symptoms. This is a meditation, a quiet journey into the small signs, the gentle knocks, the whispers of discomfort that carry sacred wisdom. In Buddhism, the body is not something to be conquered. It is something to be honored, to be heard. So today I invite you to pause, to breathe, to walk with me through 7 deeply human moments, not with fear, but with presence. And somewhere in these stories, perhaps in a forgotten name, a dropped cup, a racing heart, you may find not just warning, but awakening. If this path resonates, join us. Subscribe not just to a channel, but to the quiet art of noticing before it becomes too late. Chapter 1: When the Smile Slips. Listening before the storm arrives. I used to think the body would scream when something was truly wrong. That when life turned, there'd be a siren, a collapse, some unmistakable drama to wake me up. But sometimes life doesn't shout. It whispers. And if you're not listening closely, you might miss everything. Robert was never one to complain. At 68, he moved slower than he used to, sure, but his spirit still rose early with the sun. That morning, the light came in soft through the blinds, pooling onto the kitchen floor like honey. He stood quietly in his slippers, the old coffee machine gurgling behind him like a familiar friend. The birds outside were busy with their own routines, chirping into the morning hush, rustling the leaves like tiny wind chimes in the trees. Robert reached for his favorite mug, the one with the chipped rim and a faded eagle on the side. But when he lifted it, his fingers slipped. It was a small thing. The cup hit the tile. Porcelain shattered. But what shattered louder was the sound that came from his mouth next. "Lynn!" He tried to call for his wife, but the word came out slurred, heavy, like his tongue had forgotten its shape. His face one half smiled, the other half didn't. "Now pause here with me. Let's breathe together, just for a second. Not to panic, not to rush, but to feel." Because what was happening inside Robert was a stroke. They say that every minute during a stroke, nearly 2 million brain cells are lost. But this isn't a story about numbers. It's a story about awareness, about the soft bells of the body and whether we hear them in time. Lynn didn't wait. She didn't say, "Maybe it's just a pinched nerve." She didn't hope it would pass. She called 911. And that call, that quiet, trembling moment of choosing presence over fear, may have saved his speech, his memory, his life. We don't talk enough about these moments. Not in spiritual circles, not in family dinners, not even with ourselves. But in Buddhism, there's a deeper truth we often revisit. The body is not separate from the path. It is the vessel, the raft, the sacred mirror. The Buddha taught us to observe our breath, to notice each thought without clinging, to be present with our emotions without judgment. But how often do we extend that same compassionate awareness to our physical signs, to the tremble in our fingers, to the way our words twist unexpectedly, to the smile that forgets how to rise? Sometimes mindfulness isn't about incense or meditation cushions. Sometimes it's about standing in your kitchen, noticing that something feels off, and choosing not to ignore it. There's a Zen saying I've always loved: when the wind blows, don't blame the leaves for moving. Think about that for a moment. Slurred speech, a drooping smile, they're the leaves. The wind, that's the stroke. Invisible, yes, but urgent. And if we blame the leaves, if we only treat the symptom, we risk missing the root. In the West, they use the acronym FAST to help recognize stroke symptoms. Face drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulty. Time to call emergency services. But let's look at that again together through the Buddhist lens. F of the face as the mirror of the soul. When your smile changes, the inner self is calling out. A arms as extensions of action. When one falters, it's not just muscle, it's movement losing its harmony. S speech, our sacred bridge to truth. When it stumbles, something deeper may be shaking. T time, the greatest teacher of impermanence. When it slips through your fingers, it doesn't return. Impermanence doesn't mean fear. It means reverence. Every smile is sacred because it might not return in the same way. Every word, every lifted cup, every embrace. We don't realize how precious they are until they begin to fade. I remember once watching my own reflection in the mirror after a long day. I noticed my face looked a little tired, but then something curious. My smile didn't quite rise evenly. Past. It was nothing serious. But in that moment, I asked myself, not with panic, but with awareness, am I listening? The truth is, many of us, especially as we grow older, brush off the whispers of the body. We say things like, I'm just tired. It's nothing. It'll pass. But what if those whispers are the body's way of saying, please notice me. Please take care of me. Please don't leave me behind. You, my dear friend, are not your age. You are not your symptoms. But your body, the way it walks, talks, holds you each day, it's asking to be part of your spiritual path. And sometimes the most awakened thing we can do is pick up the phone, not out of fear, but out of fierce love. There's a softness to this practice, a humility, because we're not invincible. And in that vulnerability, there is such deep connection. When Lynn told me about the moment she saw Robert's smile falter, she said it was like watching half the moon go dark. She didn't hesitate, and in that moment, she became the embodiment of karuna, compassion in action. So today, I ask you gently, if your face ever feels strange, if your words come out wrong, if your cup slips from your hand for no reason, pause. Don't lie down and wait. Don't try to tough it out. Don't say, I'll be fine. Say instead, I am worthy of care. I deserve to be here. I choose to stay. We often treat compassion like something we give away, to strangers, to family, to animals in need. But self-compassion, that's the part we forget. Let's remember now, your body is wise. It holds stories. It holds trauma. It holds healing. And sometimes, it whispers because it's trying to stay. So please, when your smile slips, when your words feel tangled, when your reflection in the mirror looks back just a little unfamiliar, listen. The storm doesn't always come with thunder. Sometimes it arrives with the softest sound, the shatter of a cup on tile, the quiet call for help, the moment just before the light fades from one side of a smile. And in that moment, a mindfulness is not silence. It's not stillness. It's reaching for the phone with steady, sacred hands. Because staying, truly staying, requires the deepest kind of presence. And presence is everything. Chapter 2, When the Heart Sighs. The gentle cry you must not ignore. I used to believe the heart would always give us fair warning. That it would sound an alarm, roar like thunder, drop us to our knees when something was truly wrong. But it doesn't. Not always. Sometimes the heart doesn't scream, it sighs. And if you're busy, distracted, or used to being strong, that sigh can vanish like mist before sunrise, barely noticed, easily dismissed. Helen was 74 and strong in the way that doesn't make headlines. She didn't run marathons or lift weights, but she carried her life with a quiet dignity. The kind of woman who still did her own grocery shopping, who tended to her roses with names like Grace and Hope, who never missed her Tuesday book club, even when she didn't finish the chapter. That day was like any other. She had just settled into her recliner, soft blanket over her legs, a well-worn mystery novel in hand. The house was quiet, sun filtering through gauzy curtains, dust dancing slowly in the air like tiny golden prayers. And then, a heaviness, not pain exactly, not sharp, not like the movies, just a curious pressure. Low in her chest, a quiet tightness, like someone had laid a warm stone between her ribs and asked her to carry it. She closed her book and waited. Maybe gas, she thought, or the shrimp from lunch. something ordinary, but deep down something felt off. Her breath didn't come as freely. She couldn't explain it, but the room felt smaller. Even the birds outside seemed quieter. Helen didn't panic. Instead, she picked up the phone and called her daughter. It wasn't a dramatic call. She didn't cry or sound frightened. She just said, "Sweetheart, I don't feel quite right. Would you mind coming by?" Within 30 minutes, they were on the road. Within an hour, Helen was in a hospital bed. Within that same hour, doctors confirmed she was having a mild heart attack. Mild. That word sounds gentle. But in the language of the body, there's nothing mild about the heart struggling to carry us through the day. And had she waited even just a little longer, it might have been her last. We live in a world that teaches us to be tough, to push through, to not make a fuss, especially as we age. There's a kind of quiet pressure that comes with getting older, the expectation to downplay every ache, to brush off every discomfort as just part of the deal. But here's the thing, the heart doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it just sighs. In Buddhist teachings, the heart is more than just an organ. It is the seat of compassion, of presence, of truth without armor. When the Buddha spoke of the heart, he wasn't just talking about the muscle behind our ribs. He was pointing to something deeper, something sacred. There's a story I once heard in a Dharma talk. It went like this. A young monk approached his teacher, distressed. "Master," he said, "I feel broken. There's a crack inside me, something I can't explain." The old monk smiled gently and said, "Do you see this temple we sit in?" The student nodded. "There's a crack in the eastern wall," the teacher continued. "It's been there for years, small, barely visible. But if left alone, one day it will spread, and the wall may fall." The student frowned. "So we should fix it?" The teacher nodded. "Yes, not because it makes the temple ugly, but because we honor the space it holds." That story stayed with me, because our bodies are temples, and a sudden tightness in the chest, a strange pressure, a brief flutter. These are the tiny cracks in the wall. They're not ugly, they're not shameful, but they're sacred signs. Sacred because they invite us to care, not later. Now, Helen told me later that she didn't want to overreact. She almost waited, almost brushed it off. But something, a still voice inside her, urged her to act with kindness toward herself. That voice is the one we so often ignore. That's the voice we're reclaiming today. You don't have to be a doctor to recognize when something feels off. You don't need permission to listen to your body. You just need presence and a little courage. You see, compassion isn't just about how we treat others. True compassion starts here, with ourselves, with the way we respond to discomfort, not by numbing it or overriding it, but by listening like we would listen to a friend in pain. The body is wise, and sometimes it asks gently, and sometimes it begs quietly. And if we turn away, if we pretend it's nothing, we miss the invitation. There's this idea in Buddhism that clinging to certainty causes suffering. I'm fine. It's probably nothing. I don't want to make a big deal. These are forms of clinging. Clinging to pride. Clinging to the illusion that being quiet means being strong. But strength isn't silence. Strength is the courage to say, "I need help." To say, "Something doesn't feel right." To say, "I choose to take this seriously, not because I'm weak, but because I love this life I'm living." There's such beauty in that kind of vulnerability. It's like the sound of wind rustling the trees in a temple garden. Gentle, honest, fleeting. If you've ever felt that quiet pressure in your chest, if you've ever paused and thought, "This doesn't feel normal," if you've ever told yourself to wait, to be strong, to sleep it off, I want you to remember Helen. And remember this, even the most graceful roses wilt if the roots are ignored. Even the steadiest candles flicker when the air shifts. And even the strongest hearts deserve rest, care, and reverence. Next time your heart sighs, don't silence it. Hold space for it. Breathe with it. Ask it what it needs. And listen like your life depends on it. Because sometimes it does. There is no weakness in seeking help. There is only wisdom and self-respect and a deep bow to the body that has carried you through every season of your life. So if one day soon you feel something stir within your chest, not pain, not drama, just a whisper, let it be your bell of mindfulness, the call to pause, the chance to stay, the sacred moment where compassion becomes action and love becomes life. And maybe, just maybe, that single act of listening, of really listening, will be the very reason you get to bloom again tomorrow. Just like Helen, just like so many who chose to stay, not out of fear, but out of fierce, tender presence. Chapter 3, When Breath Becomes a Prayer. Listening to the silence within. I used to believe that breath was automatic, something we never had to earn, something that would always just be there. But one evening, that illusion quietly unraveled. Walter had always been a man of gentle rituals. He wasn't a monk, but he had monk-like ways. He moved through life slowly, with a kind of reverence. Mornings with fresh coffee and a folded newspaper, evenings with a soft blanket, a familiar TV show, and the muted ticking of a wall clock. He had been retired for years, and though his knees creaked and his back grumbled on rainy days, he never once complained. That evening, the sky outside was a faded watercolor, slivers of peach and lavender melting into the horizon. Inside, a lamp cast warm light on his bookcase and the edges of a framed photo. His late wife, smiling beneath a wide-brimmed hat in the garden she used to tend. The air was still, peaceful, a kind of hush that made you want to exhale a little deeper. But Walter couldn't. It didn't happen suddenly. There was no gasp, no drama, just a quiet tightness, like his chest had gently closed in on itself. He hadn't walked far, hadn't lifted anything. He was simply sitting, doing what he always did. And yet, the breath wouldn't come. He tried again, slowly, the way you might test a floorboard before stepping on it. But this breath felt narrow, like trying to inhale through a straw. The air came in shallow, and his body began to buzz. Not with pain, but with something more disorienting, like a fog rolling into the corners of the mind. A slight lightheadedness, a stillness that wasn't peace anymore, but something else. His daughter had stopped by unexpectedly, bringing pie in a foil tin, still warm. She took one look at his pale face, the way he was holding his chest without even realizing it, and without a word, she helped him to the car. At the ER, they discovered a small blood clot in his lungs. It hadn't traveled far yet. Had he gone to sleep that night thinking it was just age or just the weather, he might not have woken up at all. Breath is life. We say that so often, it starts to sound like poetry. But it's more than that. It's the bridge between body and awareness. The gate we enter again and again, every moment we choose to stay. In Buddhist practice, we're often brought back to the breath. Anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing, the practice of simply noticing. Inhale, pause, exhale, let go, repeat, gently, eternally. But what happens when the breath itself becomes unreachable? That too is a moment of mindfulness, not in stillness, but in sacred action. I remember a Dharma teacher once saying, "We are never more present than in the moment we lose our breath." At first, I thought he meant it metaphorically, those breathtaking moments of awe, of love, of grief. But later I understood. When the body gasps, the mind narrows. Everything sharpens. There is only now, only this inhale, this desperate prayer for space. And that's what it becomes, a prayer. Not with words, not with hands folded in ritual, but with lungs aching to expand, with the heart whispering, "Please stay." For Walter, that moment wasn't a dramatic fall or a flashing alarm. It was quiet. It was confusing. It was the kind of thing that could be explained away if you wanted it to be. But his daughter didn't ask questions. She didn't need a reason to act. She just knew. Sometimes love is like that. It doesn't wait for proof. It listens with the heart. Breath is often our first teacher on the path. Long before we understand sutras or meditate in lotus posture, we are breathing. As children, as elders, as beings seeking balance. And yet, as we age, we grow accustomed to brushing things off. We confuse resilience with silence. But breathlessness isn't weakness. It's a signal, a sacred knock on the door of our awareness. I wonder, have you ever sat quietly only to notice your breath feels different? Have you ever found yourself sighing more often or stopping mid-sentence to catch your breath? We blame it on stress, on weather, on too much dinner or not enough rest. But what if we paused? What if we treated every breath as a temple bell, ringing gently to call us back to this moment, to this body, to this life? In the monastery, there's a practice where monks walk in silence, barefoot, slowly, one step for every full breath. Imagine that. An entire pace, just one inhale, one exhale. No rush, no arriving, just the sacredness of being. Breath grounds us, but it also warns us. When your breath becomes tight without reason, when it trembles or flees as you sit still, that is not ordinary. That is not just age. That is the moment to listen. Walter told me weeks later that he'd almost waited it out. He didn't want to be dramatic, didn't want to trouble his daughter. But something in her face, her stillness, her fierce calm, broke through his doubt. She saw what he couldn't. And maybe that's the gift we give each other in these quiet years. Not just companionship, but clarity. The ability to notice what we might dismiss. The willingness to act when hesitation creeps in. Breathing is the most basic act of being alive. And yet, it is so easy to forget its sacredness until it falters. When you breathe deeply, you connect with every living thing. When you breathe mindfully, you remind yourself, I am still here. And when that breath becomes labored, especially in stillness, it is a bell, ringing not in fear, but in invitation, to return, to care, to act. The next time you sit and feel your chest tighten without cause, the next time your breath shallows for no reason, the next time life feels too narrow to enter freely, pause, feel your feet, feel the ground, and ask, is this my body calling for help? Takes courage to answer. But even more, takes love. Buddhism doesn't ask us to be invincible. It asks us to be awake, to notice, to cherish, even our own breath, especially our own breath. So tonight, as the world grows quiet, as the lamps glow and the air grows cool, place your hand gently on your chest. Feel the rise, the fall, and know, this breath, this life, this body is a gift. And gifts are meant to be cared for. Chapter 4, When the Mind Forgets the Way. Listening through the fog. I once believed that confusion only came in gradual waves, that memory faded like twilight, slow and predictable. But I've since learned that the mind, like a still pond, can be disturbed in an instant. A single ripple, a sudden wind, and the reflection we once saw clearly becomes blurred, strange, unfamiliar. Linda had always been the sharp one in her building. At 80 years old, she still remembered every neighbor's birthday, every grandchild's favorite cookie, and which dog on the third floor liked belly rubs and which preferred to be left alone. Her mind was her sanctuary, a well-organized cabinet of names, numbers, and stories, dusted daily with crossword puzzles and newspaper margins filled with notes in blue ink. That morning was supposed to be ordinary. The hallway smelled faintly of toast and fabric softener. The sun was rising slowly, pouring through the narrow apartment windows, casting stripes of golden light across the floor like a quiet prayer. But something was wrong. Linda stood in the hallway outside her own door, dressed and ready for her morning walk. Except she didn't remember where she was walking to, or why. She stared at the exit sign, blinking slowly, as though waiting for the fog to lift. Her neighbor, who had just come out with a bag of recycling, called her name. Linda turned, smiling faintly, but her eyes didn't quite focus. I was just on my way somewhere, she said, but she wasn't sure. Her daughter thought maybe she'd skipped breakfast, maybe she was dehydrated. That happens sometimes. But at the ER, they discovered something else. A urinary tract infection, an unexpected and quiet culprit, causing a temporary state of confusion known as delirium. Within a few days of fluids, rest, and antibiotics, Linda returned to her sharp, crossword-loving self. But had they waited, had they assumed it was just aging, the story might have ended differently. It's moments like these that remind me how fragile clarity really is, and how sacred. In the teachings of the Buddha, we are told, the mind is the forerunner of all things. Every action begins as a thought, every word a whisper in the mind first. Every intention, every emotion, every expression of love or fear, rooted in the mind's quiet soil. So what happens when that soil is shaken? When thought becomes fog? When orientation slips away like mist between your fingers? The mind, I've come to believe, is like a still pond. In its clarity, it reflects everything. The trees, the sky, the moonlight dancing across the surface. But when confusion strikes, whether from infection, fatigue, emotional overwhelm, or something deeper, it's as if a stone has been tossed into the water. The ripples spread, the image blurs, and suddenly what we knew feels distant, unreachable. I remember sitting with my grandmother once when she forgot my name, just for a moment. Her eyes scanned my face with love, but also with an unfamiliar searching. She reached for my hand and whispered, "You feel like home," but I can't remember which one. It was one of the most beautiful and heartbreaking things I've ever heard. In that moment, I didn't correct her. I didn't panic. I just stayed, held her hand, let her mind rest in that soft space between knowing and not knowing. That's the practice. To meet confusion not with fear, but with curiosity. Not with dismissal, but with compassion. There's a Zen saying, when a bell rings in the distance, it may sound soft, but it still calls you to attention. Sudden confusion is that distant bell. It's not always loud, not always obvious, but it matters. We often assume that forgetfulness is just part of getting older. And yes, the brain ages like everything else. But sudden disorientation, when someone who's usually sharp becomes scattered, when words trail off, when familiar places feel foreign, those are signs. Not of weakness, not of failure, but of imbalance, of the pond being stirred. And here's the thing. Small imbalances can create big ripples. A missed meal, a new medication, a night of poor sleep, a simple infection. These things can shift the mind's clarity in older adults faster than we imagine. But vulnerability is not the same as helplessness. When we notice, when we care, when we say, "This doesn't feel like you," and gently take someone's hand toward help, we become part of their clarity. We become the stillness returning to the pond. And it goes both ways. If you ever find yourself lost in your own home, if you ever forget why you walked into a room, if your thoughts suddenly feel jumbled, your words slow to form, or your name sits on the tip of your own tongue, pause, not in fear, but in kindness, and say to yourself, "My mind is asking for care. Let me listen." Mindfulness doesn't mean perfection. It doesn't mean never forgetting. It means noticing what is without judgment. It means asking with a heart wide open, "What's happening here?" And then following the answer, not alone but together. There's a particular kind of stillness that returns after the mind has been foggy. It's deeper somehow, more reverent, like the silence in a garden after a summer rain. The kind of peace that knows storms come and storms pass. We don't fear the fog anymore because we've learned how to walk through it with lanterns made of love. That's what I want for you, for your loved ones, for anyone who one day stands in the hallway and forgets why they're there. Not shame, not isolation, just a quiet hand on the shoulder, and a voice that says, "It's okay, we'll find the way back together." And perhaps in the end, that's the most beautiful teaching. Not just the clarity of the mind, but the clarity of connection. Chapter 5, When the Ache Speaks. Hearing the crack in the wall before it collapses. I used to think pain had a pattern, that the body would always give us a clear rhythm, a beginning, a middle, an end, a sting, a throb, a fade. But the truth is, sometimes pain doesn't knock gently. Sometimes it hides in silence, until it doesn't. Frank was 72 and carved from the kind of quiet strength that never needed to prove itself. The kind of man who still shoveled his own snow, mowed his own lawn, fixed whatever needed fixing, and believed that if it didn't bleed or break, it didn't need attention. His favorite phrase was simple, predictable, and stubborn. "It'll pass." He said it when his knees ached, when his back locked. He said it the night he felt that sharp pain in his stomach after dinner. Started small, a jabbing discomfort low in his belly, like something was caught inside and trying to twist free. He brushed it off, stood up a little straighter, muttered something about indigestion, and popped a couple of antacids. He even chuckled to himself as he lowered into his recliner, one hand gently over his belly. But the pain didn't pass. By midnight, he couldn't sleep. It was no longer a jab. It was a knife carving through his abdomen with no rhythm, no mercy. Sweat beaded on his forehead, not from heat, but from the pressure. Still, he told himself, ride it out. But by morning, he couldn't move. His daughter, who had come by to drop off some groceries, found him pale, trembling, slumped in the kitchen chair. She called an ambulance without asking. At the hospital, the diagnosis came fast. Part of his intestine had twisted during the night, cutting off its own blood supply. It required emergency surgery. The surgeon told him gently but directly, "If you'd waited another hour, Frank, we might have lost you." Frank survived. But what stayed with me, what really settled in my chest like a quiet bell, was what he told me later. "I didn't want to make a fuss," he said. "Didn't want to seem weak." That sentence stayed with me longer than the surgery ever could. Because in so many corners of our lives, we've been taught that strength looks like silence. That pain should be endured, not spoken. That worry makes you dramatic. That real men, real adults, real grown-ups just get through it. But Buddhism teaches something altogether different. Teaches that awareness is strength. That noticing is an act of power. And that true wisdom is knowing when silence becomes danger. There's a teaching I once heard in a small meditation hall during a quiet evening Dharma talk. The teacher said, "Your body is your house. You've lived in it your whole life. You know the sounds it makes, the way it settles, sighs, creaks. But if one night you hear a loud, unfamiliar crack deep in the walls, do you roll over and go back to sleep? Or do you get up, turn on the light, and check for damage?" That metaphor, so simple, pierced me, because it's true. We know our own bodies. We know when something is different. We feel it deeply, instinctively, and yet we delay. We doubt. We minimize. We say, "It's probably gas. It'll pass. I'll deal with it tomorrow." But sometimes there is no tomorrow for things like this. The body speaks, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in sharp lightning bolts of pain. And when it does, it isn't punishing us, it's trying to protect us. Pain isn't weakness, it's communication. And like all sacred communication, it deserves to be heard. Frank told me afterward that the scariest part wasn't the surgery. It was the moment he realized he'd almost died because of pride, because of silence. And isn't that something many of us have felt? That tug between, I should be fine, and something isn't right. That ache in the middle of the night that we try to sleep away. That quiet knowing we bury under a smile, a shrug, or a well-practiced, "I'm okay." But what if we treated those moments differently? What if we saw pain not as a flaw but as a sacred bell? A bell that says, wake up, come back, pay attention. Not because something is wrong with you, but because something is trying to help you stay. In Buddhist psychology, there's the practice of kayanapasana, mindfulness of the body. It doesn't ask us to ignore pain. It invites us to observe it with compassion, to notice its shape, its message, its mood, not to get lost in it, but to befriend it, to say, "I see you, I hear you, I'm listening." That night, as Frank lay in the hospital bed, for dripping slowly beside him, he told his daughter, "I thought being strong meant being quiet. Turns out, being strong means knowing when to speak up." That shift, so simple, so human, is what saves lives. And maybe your body won't shout. Maybe it will just ache. Maybe it will send you small signs. A sharp pain that arrives without reason. A strange twist that lingers. A pressure that builds like thunder inside your gut. You might think it's just something you ate. You might try to breathe through it, stretch it out, distract yourself. But I want to invite you softly, without fear, to listen. Because when your body makes a sound it's never made before, that is not the time for silence. That is the time for presence, for gentle action, for a call to someone who can help. Even if it turns out to be nothing, that act of listening is everything. Let's stop teaching ourselves that being low maintenance is a virtue. Let's stop rewarding stoicism when it costs people their lives. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to call the doctor. You are allowed to feel pain and say, I don't want to risk this. That is not weakness. That is love. Love for your life. Love for your family. Love for the body that carries you day after day through this world. So the next time something in you feels like it's cracking, don't wait for collapse. Don't wait for it to pass. Sit quietly for a moment. Breathe. Put your hand gently on your belly and ask, what are you trying to tell me? And then, like you would for a dear friend, listen, really listen, and do what needs to be done. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Because your body is sacred, and you are needed here. Chapter 6, The Body That Let Go. A Buddhist reflection on vomiting and inner distress. I used to think that letting go was always a sign of wisdom, a kind of graceful release, a sacred surrender. But then I watched someone I love let go, not in peace, but in pain, not by choice, but by force. And I realized, not all letting go is liberation. Evelyn had always had a strong stomach, strong in the way mothers tend to be. She raised 5 children on nothing but grit, good humor, and hot soup. She was the kind of woman who never measured ingredients because she trusted her hands, who never lost her temper even when the world around her seemed to, who laughed with her whole face even when her back ached and her knees whispered secrets of age. She didn't complain, ever. It just wasn't in her nature. That evening started like any other. A quiet dinner, shrimp and rice, a soft slice of bread, a little tea, the television murmuring in the background, the kitchen light casting a warm glow across the tiled floor, making it feel like home always had. Then it happened. A discomfort, then nausea, then her body suddenly, abruptly rejecting everything. She stood at the sink, gripping the counter. The sound of retching echoed against porcelain. A pause, then more. But what struck her wasn't the act itself. She'd had stomach bugs before. It was what she saw in the bowl. Not bright red blood, but something darker, rust-colored, grainy, like old coffee grounds. Tiny specks floating in the water. She stared at them, silent. Her grandson, home from college, came to check on her. He looked at the sink, then at her pale face, and without hesitation, without dramatics, he picked up the phone and dialed. At the hospital, they discovered a bleeding ulcer, a quiet wound, slowly worsening over months, irritated by the over-the-counter medication she had taken for her arthritis. It had been growing beneath the surface, unnoticed, unspoken, but no less real. The doctors told her gently, "Another night, Evelyn, and it could have gone differently." Sometimes the body lets go not to release, but because it can no longer hold on. There's a paradox in Buddhism I return to often. Letting go is sacred, yes. Letting go of attachment, letting go of anger, letting go of fear. But when the body lets go against its will, when it begins to purge violently, unexpectedly, painfully, this is not the surrender of the enlightened. This is the cry of a temple falling apart from the inside. There's a scene I always picture in moments like this. A monk sweeping the stone floor of a temple courtyard at dawn. He moves slowly, gently, as if each fallen leaf is a prayer. His hands do not rush. His heart is not in a hurry. He is not trying to cleanse the temple of its imperfection. He is honoring its impermanence. That is how we are called to care for the body, not with shame, not with avoidance, but with deep reverence. The Satipatthana Sutta teaches us to observe the body as it is, not how we wish it to be, not as it once was, not as it appears to others, but as it is, even when it trembles, even when it breaks, even when it lets go of things we'd rather it keep. Evelyn later told me, "I didn't want to bother anyone, And isn't that so familiar? How many of us have said the same? I'll wait until morning. It's probably nothing. I don't want to be dramatic. But here's the quiet truth. Silence isn't strength if it hides suffering. Minimizing what hurts isn't humility. It's a kind of denial. And denial is not mindfulness. Vomiting blood, whether red and bright or dark and subtle, is not something to watch and wait. It is the body's urgent message that something is wrong, that something within is tearing, bleeding, breaking, and it deserves our full attention. In our culture, we're often taught to tough it out, especially those who were raised in times of hardship. You didn't go to the doctor unless you absolutely had to. You didn't call for help unless the roof caved in. But this teaching, this old conditioning, can be dangerous, because the body has its own wisdom, and when it begins to reject from within, we must treat it not as an inconvenience, but as a sacred bell calling us back to care. Evelyn's story, like so many others, reminds me that compassion isn't always about others. It starts right here, with ourselves, with choosing to listen, to ask for help, to go in when our instinct is to brush it off. It's easy to feel embarrassed, to worry about wasting someone's time. But would you say the same to a friend? If someone you loved called and said, "I'm seeing blood," would you tell them to wait? Of course not. So why is it so hard to offer ourselves that same grace? Sometimes what looks like overreacting is actually wise responding. Sometimes calling the hospital isn't fear, it's love. Sometimes sitting in that ER room, surrounded by the hum of fluorescent lights and the quiet clatter of machines, is the most mindful place you can be, because you are choosing life. You are choosing to stay. You are saying, this body still matters. This body still serves. This life still has something left to bloom. And that is enough. That is everything. There's a quiet kind of strength in admitting we need help, in noticing the dark flecks in the bowl, in feeling the unease in our gut and honoring it. Not because we want to panic, but because we want to live. Buddhism reminds us that even the body's suffering can be our teacher. That pain can be a doorway, not one we seek, but one we do not ignore when it opens. So tonight, if you feel something unsettled in your stomach, if you see what shouldn't be there, if your body starts to let go in ways that feel wrong, don't wait. Don't hope it passes. Place your hand on your heart. Take a breath. And say gently, as if speaking to a beloved child, "I hear you. I see you. Let's go get the care we need." You are not being dramatic. You are being wise. And wisdom in this life may just be the most sacred medicine of all. Let me know when you're ready for Chapter 7. Chapter 7, When the Fire Burns Too Bright. A Buddhist reflection on fever and urgency. I used to believe that illness always gave you time. Time to notice. Time to prepare, time to respond. But sometimes it comes like fire, sudden, hungry, and unforgiving. And not all flames light the path. Some try to consume it. Jerry had been a school principal for nearly 40 years. He wore his routine like a second skin, mornings with a cup of tea, the soft rustle of a newspaper, and a sharpened pencil always ready for his beloved crossword. His mind was his playground, his temple, his pride. He used to joke that puzzles kept the cobwebs out of his brain. He wasn't the kind of man to make a fuss. He was steady, reliable, the kind of neighbor who brought in your bins when you forgot, the kind of grandfather who always remembered to ask how the spelling bee went. That morning, something was different. The words in the crossword didn't come, not even the easy ones. He stared at the grid, blinking, confused. He reached for his tea, but his hands shook. The warmth that usually soothed him felt sharp. The light pouring in through the kitchen window, the same light that had once made the linoleum glow like honey, stabbed at his eyes. When he tried to tilt his head forward, a pain like pressure bloomed in his neck, radiating upward, as though someone had taken hold of the back of his skull and squeezed. By noon, he was burning with fever. By 1, he was shivering and nauseated. By 2, he could barely speak. It was his neighbor, a retired nurse, who noticed the quiet. She hadn't seen him collect his mail. She knocked once, then again. When he didn't answer, She let herself in with the spare key he'd given her. "Just in case," he'd said, with a wink, when she found him, curled in his armchair, confused, mumbling, skin clammy and flushed. She didn't wait. She drove him to the hospital herself. Fast, focused, like someone who understood that time is not always kind. The diagnosis: bacterial meningitis, a fierce infection of the brain's protective lining. It had come quickly, quietly, but her quick action saved his life. I think about that day often. How many of us imagine illness as a slow approach, a knock at the door we'll hear in time? But sometimes it doesn't knock. It breaks in. The Buddha spoke of 3 fires: craving, aversion, and delusion. He warned us of the flames that live not outside, but within, the fires that cloud our minds, the ones that make us cling, fear, and forget who we truly are. But there are other fires too, literal ones, fevers that burn too hot, too fast. And these too are to be met not with fear, but with fierce, loving presence. Your nervous system, this delicate web of awareness, is a temple. It's where your memories live, where your thoughts are born, where joy is processed, where sorrow takes shape. When infection enters that temple, it doesn't just disturb the peace, it threatens the very seat of consciousness. And yet, how often do we downplay a fever? It's probably just a cold. I just need to rest. I'll wait until tomorrow. But when the fire rises too fast, when the body shakes and the light hurts and the mind fogs, tomorrow may not come. That's the uncomfortable truth we're learning to hold gently. Jerry later told me that he thought he was just run down, that maybe he'd skipped a meal, didn't sleep enough. But the fire inside him wasn't from overwork or worry. It was a signal, a flare in the night sky of the body. And had his neighbor not trusted her instinct, had she waited or doubted her role, he might not have survived. Buddhism teaches us about interdependence, the truth that we are not separate, that my pain echoes in you, that your delay touches me, that our lives are threads in the same beautiful, fragile tapestry. When we delay care, we don't just risk ourselves. We cause quiet suffering in those who love us, our children, our friends, our neighbors who wait for us to wave from the window. There's something deeply sacred about choosing to stay, about listening to the body not with panic, but with compassion, about saying, I matter enough to get help. And help, in this case, is not a weakness. It's a form of practice. It's mindfulness in motion, to recognize the signs: a fever that rises fast, a neck that stiffens suddenly, a headache that feels like pressure building from within, nausea, sensitivity to light, confusion, and to respond not later, now. I once watched a monk tend to a small fire at the edge of the temple garden. He didn't stomp it out. He didn't fear it. He sat beside it with a small bowl of water, adding just enough to keep the flame from spreading. That's how we're invited to treat our inner fire, not as something to be ashamed of, not as something to ignore, but as something to sit beside, to tend, to cool with care. Jerry's recovery wasn't immediate, but he lived, and when he returned home, the crossword puzzle waited for him, blank and open. He said that first word he filled in felt like a prayer, not because it was clever, but because he was still here to write it. So if your body begins to burn, if your neck refuses to move, if the light makes your eyes water and your thoughts begin to drift, don't wait. Answer the fire, with presence, with courage, with love. You're not a burden. You're not being dramatic. You are sacred, and your awareness is a temple worth protecting. And perhaps that is the deepest vow we can make in this chapter of life. To not burn ourselves away trying to be strong, but to stay. Stay even when the flames rise. Stay even when it's inconvenient. Stay, because someone is still waiting for your stories, your smile, your quiet wisdom. Stay because the bell still rings when you breathe. And this world, this ordinary, flickering, sacred world, still needs your breath in it. So now you've heard them all, 7 signs, 7 sacred whispers, woven not just with medical truth, but with the still thread of Buddhist insight. A a smile that fades on one side, a heart that sighs instead of shouting, a breath that shortens in stillness, a fog that settles across the mind, an ache that waits in silence, a body that lets go without warning, and a fire that burns too bright, too fast. None of these are just physical symptoms. They are messages, lanterns glowing on the edge of the path, asking us to turn toward ourselves with compassion, with care, with courage. We often wait until it's too late. But what if wisdom meant listening earlier? What if love meant acting sooner? Buddhism teaches that everything is impermanent. Yes, but that doesn't mean we surrender to decay. It means we cherish. It means we choose. It means we stay present for this body, this breath, this fleeting sacred life. So now I ask you, which moment in your own life whispered to you? And did you listen? Share it in the comments below. Your reflection may be the bell that awakens someone else. And if you'd like to walk with us again, if this gentle way of seeing, breathing, and healing feels like home, subscribe, not because you must, but because you're ready. And maybe, just maybe, your next breath, your next noticing, your next act of self-kindness will be the reason someone else gets to stay too. Together we remember, together we listen, together we stay.